Every season, the royal pack hosted a grand ball: spring ball, summer ball, harvest ball, winter ball. For most wolves, they were celebrations filled with music, dancing, and expensive wine. For noble families, they were opportunities to build alliances. For ambitious alphas, they were stages upon which futures were decided. For Isolde Ravencrest, they were a reminder of everything she didn't have. 3 years earlier, peace between two rival territories had been secured through a political engagement. One side offered the future Alpha King. The other offered the daughter of one of the kingdom's most influential families. The arrangement worked. The war ended. Trade recovered. The kingdom prospered. Everyone celebrated the success, except the two people expected to marry. At least, that was how it often felt to Isolde. Alpha King Cassian Thornwolf had never been cruel, never insulting, never openly dismissive. In many ways, that made everything worse, because cruelty could be confronted. Indifference simply existed. Whenever they attended events together, Cassian greeted her politely, asked how she was, commented on the weather, then moved on to more important conversations. Diplomats, generals, council members, anyone but her. As months turned into years, Isolde learned to expect it. She stood beside the throne when protocol required, smiled when photographs were taken, answered questions from nobles, performed every duty expected of a future Luna. Meanwhile, her fiancé treated her like a respected acquaintance. Nothing more. The realization settled heavily as preparations began for the winter moon ball. Servants rushed through palace corridors carrying decorations. Musicians rehearsed in the grand hall. Visiting nobles arrived from distant territories. Everyone spoke excitedly about the celebration. Everyone except Isolde. That evening, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, while a maid adjusted the silver embroidery on her gown. "You'll look beautiful tonight, my lady," the maid said warmly. Isolde offered a small smile. "Thank you." The maid hesitated, then quietly asked, "Do you think His Majesty will finally dance with you this year?" The question struck harder than it should have, because the answer came immediately. "No." The maid fell silent. Neither woman believed otherwise. A few hours later, Isolde entered the palace ballroom. Crystal chandeliers illuminated hundreds of guests. Music echoed through the magnificent hall. At the far end of the room stood Alpha King Cassian Thornwolf, surrounded by advisors, diplomats, nobles, important people. For a brief moment, his gaze passed over her, then continued elsewhere, as though she were simply another guest. Not his fiancée, not the woman promised to share his future, just someone standing in the room. And for the first time in 3 years, Isolde felt something inside her finally begin to change. The winter moon ball was the largest celebration of the year. By midnight, the palace glittered with light and laughter. Music drifted beneath crystal chandeliers. Nobles danced across polished marble floors. Servants moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with wine and desserts. To everyone else, the evening looked perfect. To Isolde, it felt exhausting. For hours, she performed exactly as expected. She greeted visiting dignitaries, welcomed noble families, smoothed over minor disagreements before they became public embarrassments. More than once, she quietly prevented diplomatic misunderstandings that would have caused trouble for the crown. Nobody noticed. They rarely did, because when Isolde solved problems, crises disappeared before anyone realized they existed. Across the ballroom, Alpha King Cassian continued entertaining guests. Every time she glanced in his direction, He seemed surrounded by admirers. Young noblewomen laughed at his jokes. Foreign ambassadors competed for his attention. Council members requested private discussions. Cassian gave each of them his time, his focus, his attention, everything except a meaningful glance toward his fiancée. Not once that entire evening had he approached her. Not once had he asked her to dance. Not once had he looked for her. The realization should not have hurt anymore. After 3 years, she ought to have grown accustomed to it, yet somehow it still did. Near midnight, an elderly ambassador approached her. Lord Armand had known her family since childhood. Unlike most nobles, he possessed the annoying habit of noticing things. "You seem unhappy tonight." Isolde offered a practiced smile. "I'm perfectly fine." The old wolf snorted. Terrible lie. She laughed softly, despite herself. Lord Armand studied her for a moment. Then his expression softened. "How much longer are you going to do this?" The question caught her off guard. Do what? Stand beside a man who never bothers to look beside him. Silence. For a moment, Isolde simply stared into the crowd, toward the throne, toward the Alpha King, toward the future she had spent 3 years waiting for. Nothing changed. Nothing ever did. And suddenly, she felt tired. Not angry, not heartbroken, just tired. A strange sense of clarity settled over her, the kind that arrives after disappointment repeats itself long enough. She looked back at Lord Armand, then surprised herself with her answer. "I think this is my last ball." The elderly ambassador blinked. "What?" A faint smile touched her lips. "The last one." For the first time in years, the words felt right. Not painful, not frightening. Liberating. Across the room, Cassian laughed at something one of the diplomats said. He never noticed her watching. And for the first time, Isolde realized she no longer cared whether he did. By the end of the evening, she had made her decision. She would fulfill her remaining obligations. Then she would stop showing up. And if nobody noticed she was gone, at least she would finally know the truth. 2 months later, the spring ball arrived. As always, preparations consumed the palace for weeks. Servants polished every chandelier. Musicians rehearsed endlessly. Noble families traveled from across the kingdom. Everything unfolded according to tradition, except for one thing. Isolde Ravencrest wasn't there. At first, nobody seemed concerned. Guests arrived, late all the time. Perhaps her carriage had been delayed. Perhaps she was speaking with officials elsewhere in the palace. Perhaps she would appear eventually. The evening continued. Hours passed. Her place beside the throne remained empty. Several nobles exchanged curious glances. A few whispered among themselves. Still, the celebration moved forward, and Cassian barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on trade discussions and diplomatic negotiations. When one advisor casually mentioned Isolde's absence, he simply nodded. "I'm sure she had a reason." The response satisfied everyone, at least for that evening. Then, the summer ball arrived. Again, Isolde was absent. This time, people noticed immediately. Questions began circulating through the ballroom. Is Lady Isolde ill? Has she returned to her family's territory? Was there some disagreement? Nobody seemed to know. Cassian heard the rumors, but dismissed them. If something important had happened, someone would have informed him. Wouldn't they? The evening passed. Yet several times, he found his eyes drifting toward the space beside the throne. An empty space that somehow felt larger than it should. He ignored the strange feeling. The harvest ball arrived 3 months later. Once again, Isolde didn't attend. Now, the whispers became impossible to ignore. Even foreign dignitaries noticed. One visiting alpha openly asked where the future Luna had gone. The question left several advisors exchanging uncomfortable looks. Late in the evening, Councilwoman Meredith approached the throne. "Your Majesty." Cassian glanced up from a report. "Yes, Lady Isolde sent something." For the first time, his full attention shifted toward her. "A message?" The councilwoman nodded and handed him a folded letter. "It's addressed to the palace administration." Cassian accepted it casually, expecting some explanation. A scheduling conflict, travel obligations, something simple. He unfolded the paper, read the first line, then stopped. The ballroom noise seemed to fade into the background. The letter contained only a single sentence. Short, polite, final. "Please stop reserving a place for me. I won't be attending future balls." For several seconds, Cassian simply stared at the words. Around him, music continued. Guests laughed. Conversations flowed. Yet something felt strangely wrong, as though a piece of the evening no longer fit. His gaze slowly lifted toward the empty place beside the throne. The place Isolde had occupied for 3 years. The place he had never thought twice about until now, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly found himself wondering where she was. The letter should not have bothered him. At least, that was what Cassian told himself. People declined invitations all the time. Nobles traveled. Officials became busy. Schedules changed. There was no reason Isolde's absence should occupy his thoughts. Yet, during the weeks that followed, he kept thinking about it. The realization irritated him, especially because he couldn't explain why. The next royal gathering was a smaller diplomatic banquet, attended by visiting ambassadors and council leaders. Cassian arrived expecting an ordinary evening. Instead, he spent most of it distracted. Several times, his eyes drifted toward the entrance, then toward the familiar place beside the throne, then back toward the crowd. Each time, he found exactly what he expected. Nothing. No silver-haired noblewoman, no calm, composed presence, no Isolde. The strange thing was that he had spent years attending these same events without paying much attention to her at all. Now, her absence seemed impossible to ignore. Halfway through the evening, his longtime advisor, Rowan Hale, finally noticed. "You've checked the entrance 6 times. Cassian frowned. "I have not." "You have." "I wasn't counting." Rowan's expression remained annoyingly amused. "Neither was I. It simply became impossible to miss." Cassian looked away. "I was looking for arriving guests." "Of course." The sarcasm was impossible to miss. A few moments later, Rowan asked a question that unexpectedly caught him off guard. "When was the last time you spoke with Lady Isolde?" Cassian opened his mouth, then paused. The answer should have come immediately. Instead, he found himself searching his memory. There had been conversations, surely, official discussions, formal greetings, public events, but the last meaningful conversation, the last time they spoke for longer than a few minutes, the last time he asked about her life, nothing came to mind. The realization unsettled him. Across the ballroom, a group of foreign diplomats laughed together. Cassian knew their names, their political affiliations, their trade interests, their family histories. He could list details about rulers from territories hundreds of miles away. Yet somehow, he knew almost nothing about the woman he was supposed to marry. For the first time, that fact felt embarrassing. When the banquet finally ended, Cassian remained seated long after most guests had departed. The ballroom looked strangely empty, or perhaps not empty, incomplete. His gaze drifted once more toward the vacant place beside the throne. 3 years. 3 years of sharing the same spaces, 3 years of attending the same events, 3 years of never really paying attention. Rowan's voice broke the silence. If you're curious, Your Majesty, you could simply ask where she is. Cassian looked up. For a moment, he considered dismissing the suggestion. Instead, he stood. Find out where Lady Isolde has been spending her time. Rowan raised an eyebrow. Immediately. Cassian hesitated, then nodded. Immediately, because for the first time in 3 years, he realized he genuinely wanted to know. The answer arrived the following morning. Cassian expected a brief report, a simple explanation. Perhaps Isolde had returned to her family's estate. Perhaps she was traveling. Perhaps she had become tired of court life. Instead, Rowan entered the royal study carrying an entire stack of documents. Cassian frowned immediately. What's all that? Information about Lady Isolde. The Alpha King stared. Why would that require so much paperwork? Rowan's expression turned strangely neutral. Because she's been very busy. A feeling of unease settled in Cassian's chest. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Explain. Rowan sat down and opened the first report. 6 months ago, Lady Isolde began overseeing reconstruction efforts in the Eastern Territories. Cassian blinked. Reconstruction? The flood-damaged villages. Silence. He vaguely remembered hearing something about floods. Months ago. Then Rowan opened another file. 3 months later, she funded the construction of 4 schools. Another document followed. She negotiated a trade agreement between 3 border settlements. Then another. And she organized agricultural support programs for struggling farming communities. Cassian stared at the growing pile. Every page seemed to reveal another project, another accomplishment, another responsibility, all completed successfully, all led by Isolde. Why wasn't I informed about this? The question came out sharper than intended. Rowan looked at him carefully, then answered with painful honesty. You were. Silence. Cassian frowned. What? Repeatedly. The advisor pulled a report from the stack. You approved funding for one of the schools. Another document. You signed the trade agreement she negotiated. Then another. You reviewed the reconstruction budget. The room became very quiet, because Cassian suddenly remembered. Not the details, only fragments, names on reports, projects requiring approval, administrative paperwork he skimmed before signing. At the time, he never paid attention to who was leading those efforts. Now he knew. And somehow, that made everything worse. Rowan closed the final file. The truth is, Your Majesty, most of the court already knows about her work. Cassian looked up. What do you mean? The advisor gave him a level look. Everyone talks about it. The words landed heavily. Everyone knew. Everyone except him. For several moments, neither spoke. Then, Cassian stood and walked toward the window overlooking the capital. The city stretched across the horizon, busy, thriving, alive. How many other things had he overlooked? How many times had Isolde accomplished something remarkable while he looked elsewhere? The question was uncomfortable, because the answer was becoming obvious. Far too many. Behind him, Rowan gathered the reports. So what happens now? Cassian remained silent for a moment, then made a decision. When is she expected to return? To the capital? Yes. Rowan shook his head. Not anytime soon. The answer came immediately. Then I'll go to her? For the first time, genuine surprise crossed Rowan's face. And for the first time in years, Cassian found himself looking forward to seeing Isolde Ravencrest. Not as a political obligation, not as a future wife, but as a woman he was finally beginning to realize he never truly knew. 3 days later, Cassian arrived in the Eastern Territories. Officially, the visit was an inspection of regional development projects. Unofficially, everyone knew better, including him. The journey had taken longer than expected, but as his carriage rolled through the first village, Cassian immediately understood why the reports had been so impressive. The place looked transformed. Freshly repaired roads connected homes that had once been damaged by flooding. New market stalls lined the central square. Children ran between buildings, carrying books and supplies. The settlement felt alive, hopeful, thriving, and at the center of it all stood Isolde. She wasn't wearing noble silks. There were no jeweled accessories, no symbols of status. Instead, she wore practical traveling clothes and held a stack of documents beneath one arm while speaking with a group of merchants. The villagers listened attentively, not because they had to, because they respected her. Cassian remained where he was, watching. A merchant raised a concern about transportation costs. Isolde listened, asked questions, suggested alternatives. Within minutes, a solution had been reached. The discussion ended with smiles. No authority, no threats, no commands, just competence. The simplicity of it caught him off guard. One by one, more people approached her. Farmers, builders, teachers, families. She seemed to know all of them, and more surprisingly, they seemed to know her. Not Lady Ravencrest, not future Luna, simply Isolde, a woman they trusted. After nearly an hour, she finally noticed him. Her eyes widened slightly, only slightly. Then she excused herself from the crowd and walked toward him. No nervousness, no excitement, no visible emotion at all. Just calm curiosity. Your Majesty. Cassian found himself strangely disappointed by the formality. You seem surprised. A little. She glanced toward the royal escort waiting nearby. This is quite a distance from the capital. I could say the same to you. A faint smile appeared. The first genuine smile he'd seen from her in years. I live here now. The simple statement caught him off guard. Not visit, not work. Live, as though the Eastern Territories had become her home, as though the palace no longer mattered. For some reason, that thought unsettled him. I came to inspect the reconstruction efforts. The excuse sounded weak, even to his own ears. Judging by the look in Isolde's eyes, she agreed, but she politely ignored it. Then you've arrived at a good time. She gestured toward the village. We're finishing several major projects. Cassian looked around again, at the repaired buildings, the thriving businesses, the people smiling as they moved through the streets. Then, back at her. For years, he had viewed Isolde as part of a treaty, a political necessity, a future obligation. Standing here now, surrounded by evidence of her accomplishments, he felt something deeply uncomfortable. Because for the first time, he was seeing her clearly, and what he saw was remarkable. Cassian should have returned to the capital the next morning. That had been the original plan. Inspect the projects, review the reports, meet with local officials, then leave. Instead, he stayed. 1 extra day became 3. 3 became a week. Officially, he claimed he was conducting a thorough assessment of regional development. Unofficially, he spent most of his time watching Isolde work. The more he observed, the more confused he became, because none of what he saw matched the image he had carried for 3 years. At the palace, Isolde had always seemed quiet, reserved, almost distant. Here, she was entirely different. Not louder, not dramatic, simply alive. People sought her advice constantly. Children ran to greet her when she passed through the village. Merchants stopped to share updates about their businesses. Farmers proudly showed her the results of new agricultural programs she had introduced, and somehow she remembered everyone: names, families, personal details, even small conversations from months earlier. One afternoon, Cassian accompanied her during a visit to a newly completed school. The moment they entered, several children rushed toward Isolde. "Lady Isolde, we finished the reading challenge. You promised to see our drawings." She laughed. Actually, laughed. The sound surprised him, not because it was unpleasant, because he had rarely heard it before. For years, he had only known the composed noblewoman standing beside him at formal events. Now he was meeting someone else entirely, someone warm, someone genuine, someone he should have noticed long ago. Later that evening, they walked through the village square together. For once, no advisors followed them. No guards hovered nearby. The setting sun painted the streets gold. A little girl suddenly ran toward them, carrying a basket of flowers. Without hesitation, she handed one to Isolde, then another to Cassian. "For good luck." Before either could respond, she disappeared again. Isolde smiled down at the flower. Cassian found himself smiling too. A strange silence settled between them. Comfortable, easy, unfamiliar. Finally, he asked the question that had been bothering him for days. "Why didn't you ever tell me about all this?" Isolde looked genuinely puzzled. "I did." Cassian blinked. "What?" "The schools, the villages, the trade programs." She shrugged lightly. "I submitted reports every month." The answer hit harder than expected. Because she was right. She had told him, repeatedly. He simply hadn't listened. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Isolde glanced toward him. A faint smile touched her lips. "You look disappointed." "I am." Her eyebrow lifted. "Why?" Cassian stared at the flower in his hand, then answered honestly. "Because I'm realizing how much I missed." For a brief moment, something unreadable crossed her expression. Then it disappeared, and for the first time, Cassian wondered if perhaps he wasn't the only one carrying regrets. The summer solstice ball was the most anticipated event of the year. For generations, it had marked the height of the social season. Nobles traveled from every corner of the kingdom. Foreign dignitaries attended. Political alliances were strengthened. Engagements were announced. Deals were negotiated beneath glittering chandeliers. This year, however, only one topic dominated conversation. Isolde Ravencrest was returning. The news spread through the capital weeks in advance. By the time the evening arrived, curiosity filled every corner of the palace. Many guests had not seen her in nearly a year. Others wanted to know whether the engagement remained intact. Everyone expected answers. No one expected what actually happened. Cassian arrived early. For reasons he refused to examine too closely, he found himself watching the entrance. Again, and again, and again. The moment Isolde stepped into the ballroom, the room seemed to shift. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Whispers spread. She looked elegant as always. But something was different. Not her appearance, her confidence. The woman who entered the ballroom no longer seemed defined by her position beside the throne. She stood entirely on her own, and everyone noticed, including Cassian. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the crowded hall. Then she continued forward without hesitation, without lingering, without seeking him out. The realization left him strangely unsettled. As the evening progressed, Cassian found himself watching her repeatedly. She spoke with diplomats, laughed with old friends, discussed trade proposals with regional leaders. Everywhere she went, people gravitated toward her, not because of her title, because they genuinely enjoyed her company. The sight stirred something uncomfortable inside him. Regret. Near midnight, the formal announcements began. The ballroom gradually quieted. Guests gathered near the throne platform. Cassian expected routine proceedings, official recognitions, trade updates, nothing unusual. Then, Isolde stepped forward, carrying a sealed document. A strange feeling settled in his chest. The room grew silent. Without a word, she walked directly toward him. Every eye in the ballroom followed. Cassian accepted the scroll. His stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Slowly, he broke the seal. The title alone made his pulse stumble. Petition for dissolution of engagement. The words blurred for a moment. Around him, shocked whispers erupted throughout the ballroom. Several nobles gasped openly. Council members exchanged alarmed looks. Cassian barely heard any of it. His gaze lifted toward Isolde. She stood calmly before him, composed, certain, as though she had already made peace with this decision long ago. Isolde? For the first time in years, urgency entered his voice. Real urgency. But as he looked into her eyes, he realized something devastating. The woman who had spent 3 years waiting for him was no longer waiting at all. The ballroom remained in chaos long after Isolde left. Whispers spread through every corner of the palace. Nobles debated. Advisors panicked. Council members scrambled to assess the political consequences. Cassian ignored all of them. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about treaties, or diplomacy, or appearances. He was thinking about Isolde, the woman he had spent 3 years overlooking and who had just walked away. He found her on a quiet balcony overlooking the palace gardens. Moonlight bathed the stone railings in silver. The sounds of the celebration drifted faintly from inside. Isolde stood alone, calm, as if the most shocking announcement of the evening had never happened. Cassian approached slowly. "You left rather quickly." A faint smile touched her lips. "I didn't think there was much reason to stay." The words landed harder than he expected. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, he held up the folded document. "You're ending the engagement." "Yes." No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just certainty. Cassian stared at her. Why? For the first time that evening, genuine confusion crossed her face, as though she couldn't understand why he needed to ask. Finally, she sighed. "Do you really not know?" The question left him silent, because the honest answer was no, not completely. Isolde looked toward the gardens below. "When we were engaged, I tried." Her voice remained calm. "I attended every ball, every ceremony, every official gathering." Cassian listened quietly. "I learned everything I could about your kingdom." A brief pause. "I made room in my life for you." The silence between them deepened. Then she looked directly at him. "And you never noticed." There it was. The truth. Simple. Unavoidable. Painfully clear. Cassian opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because she was right. There had been no great betrayal. No dramatic conflict. No rival lover. Only years of neglect. Years of assuming she would always be there. "I didn't realize," he said quietly. A sad smile appeared. "I know." And somehow, those 2 words hurt more than anger ever could, because she wasn't accusing him. She was stating a fact. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Cassian stepped closer. "I should have paid attention." "Yes." No argument, no comfort, just honesty. The simplicity of it made his chest tighten. Then he asked the question he already feared. "If I had realized sooner." His voice trailed off. Isolde understood anyway. For the first time, genuine warmth entered her expression. But it wasn't hope. It wasn't longing. It was kindness. Maybe things would have been different. The answer should have reassured him. Instead, it felt like a goodbye, because the opportunity she spoke of no longer existed. And for the first time in 3 years, Cassian understood exactly what he had lost. The engagement ended 2 weeks later. Official announcements were released. The council approved the dissolution. The treaty remained intact. Politically, everything proceeded smoothly. The kingdom survived. Life continued. Yet for Cassian, something felt profoundly different. For years, Isolde had been a permanent fixture in his world, a presence so constant that he stopped seeing it. Now she was gone, and suddenly her absence appeared everywhere. At council meetings, he found himself expecting her observations. At diplomatic events, he noticed how often discussions drifted off course without her quiet interventions. At royal balls, the empty place beside the throne seemed impossible to ignore. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years, Isolde had stood beside him while he looked everywhere else. Now he searched every room for someone who no longer needed to be there. Months passed, then a year. News of Isolde continued reaching the capital. Her educational programs expanded across the eastern territories. Trade flourished. New villages prospered under her leadership. Every report carried the same message. Success followed wherever she went. One afternoon, Rowan entered the royal study carrying another regional report. Cassian skimmed the first page, then smiled despite himself. "What is it this time?" "Agricultural reforms," Rowan replied. "Successful?" "Very." Cassian nodded. Of course they were. The response no longer surprised him. After Rowan departed, Cassian remained staring out the window overlooking the capital. The city stretched beneath the afternoon sunlight. Busy, alive, growing. Leadership had taught him many lessons over the years. Some arrived through victory, others through failure. But none had changed him. Quite like Isolde, because she taught him something no advisor ever had. People rarely become invisible on their own. They become invisible because someone stops looking, and the consequences often arrive too late. From that day forward, Cassian ruled differently. He learned the names of palace servants, acknowledged the work of overlooked officials, paid attention when people spoke, not because it improved his image, because he understood what neglect could cost. Years later, younger alphas occasionally asked him for leadership advice. His answer rarely changed. Never assume someone will stay simply because they always have. Most expected lessons about warfare, politics, power. Instead, he offered something far simpler: appreciation, attention, presence. Because kingdoms were not sustained by grand speeches or royal decrees alone. They were built by loyal people working quietly in the background. The very people most leaders forgot to notice. And every time he attended a royal ball, Cassian remembered a woman who had once stood beside him through countless celebrations. A woman he ignored for 3 years. A woman he only truly saw after she walked away. By then, Isolde no longer needed his attention. She had built a life that belonged entirely to her. And that, more than anything else, taught him the lesson he would never forget.